You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is Brian McClanahan, your host. This is episode 43, and it covers the week of September 19th through September 23rd, 2016. Glad to have you back on the program. We had a really interesting week at the Institute, and I think it's indicative of one of the things that we try to do here, and that is focus on statesmanship. So I'll talk about that a little bit more, but before I do that, again, some housekeeping. Wanted to remind you that the Institute exists on your generous contributions alone, so if you're interested in the podcast, if you like the website, please consider making a generous contribution to the Institute. For less than one all-star special a month at Waffle House, you can support us, keep the podcast going, keep the Institute up and running, the webpage going, and help us put together programs that explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. Also, like us on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube. Share our information around there. There's no better source for information nowadays than social media. This is where people get most of their information. And so when you share our material on social media, you help influence your friends and start conversations about the Southern tradition. And that's what it's all about. We are interested in Southern history from the founding of the British North American colonies in 1607 up until the present. So we try to have articles and information on a variety of Southern topics, whether it's culture, whether it's politics, things like art, music, literature, philosophy, all those things. So also, if you have any ideas for an article or you'd like to send them our way, please go onto our website, www.abbevilleinstitute.org, and find the article submission tab at the top. It's under the contact tab. You click down on that and you can submit an article. So we're always interested in new material. We're always looking for new writers and new voices of the South and on different topics. And again, one of the areas that we really like to see is more 20th century material. We have a lot of 18th and 19th century material, but not a whole lot of 20th century material. So please consider that. There's a vastly unexplored area there for review and for discussion. And in fact, we're going to talk about that a little bit this week. So let's get started with our material. First and foremost, this week was focused mainly on statesmanship. So one of the things that is important about the Southern tradition was its leaders, its leadership over time. And that leadership extends from the earliest Southern settlers, say, for example, John Smith, up until the present day. And, of course, we don't have too many great leaders in the political class today. We have a lot of politicians and not statesmen. But what you can find throughout Southern history are great examples of statesmanship. There is a difference between a statesman and a politician. A statesman is someone who firmly believes in principles and acts on those even when the popular will is against them. And so a nice example of that would be someone like John C. Calhoun, who spoke for the South. We're actually going to we have a piece on Calhoun today, which is an unknown part of Calhoun's political philosophy, written by the great Clyde Wilson. But we have two other individuals who are not very well known, but were definitely indicative of this Southern statesmanship that was so important in developing the United States. Now, Southerners took a dominant leadership role through much of early American history, even into the 20th century. You could find Southerners who were in a leadership role, important Southerners, but particularly in the early federal period, you had, of course, George Washington's a Southerner, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe. But beyond that, you had other Southerners who were making quite effective points about the Constitution or about federalism in this period of time. And a lot of these people were some of the best men of society. And they were just as influential in their own state as they were in either New York, Philadelphia, or Washington, D.C., as the capital moved over time. And I think in some ways that's even more impressive because for most of these men, the state was the center of life, not Washington, D.C., or the federal capital, wherever it may be. And so it was just as important to play a role at your state, in your state government, or in your state constitutional convention, as it was in the federal capital. And I'm reminded of, for example, in the 1820s when Virginia revised its constitution, you had men in that constitutional convention in Virginia that were prominent members of the government in Washington, D.C. Men who had been more well known as representatives of the state of Virginia at the federal level than at the state level, but yet they took a great interest in state politics and in Virginia's constitution itself. And I think that's important because nowadays, if a state was to start looking at revamping its constitution, most of your people in Washington, D.C. would be uninterested in that. That's small fish, right? That's not something that I need to worry about. What they want to be is a big fish in the big pond. They don't really care about being a big fish in the small pond, which is how they look at the state. The state is the minor leagues for the general government. But we should always look at it the other way around. Why is it that we never talk about enlarging state power when it comes to vis-a-vis the general government? Why is it we're always looking and interested in enlarging federal power? Wouldn't it be better if that's who you want to be? If you're a person that's intrigued by power, power is power, no matter where you have it. And so we should be suspicious of people that pursue that. But you should always be interested in your state and what's happening there, because that is really where politics hit the road. I mean, that's where the rubber hits the road. This is where things get done. And so statesmanship and statescraft is very important, even at the state and local level. So as we go through our lives and our own businesses, industries, whatever we're doing, it's important to remember statesmanship and how to move men. Politics is the art of moving men, but how do we do that? What examples do we have throughout history that would give us some clues on doing this effectively? And I think that's where people like John C. Calhoun and then two other individuals this week, James Jackson of Georgia and Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Maryland, come into play. Now, you might be saying, Maryland, that's not a southern state. Well, it was very definitely a southern state in the 18th century and into the 19th century when Carroll was alive. And it also explains that there are different types of Southerners. There wasn't just one stock Southerner. I think this is what popular culture would have you believe. Southerners are all the same. They're just all these backwoods hillbillies who don't know anything. Of course, we all know that's not true. Calhoun was, as Clyde Wilson says in his piece, as one time considered to be one of the greatest American thinkers ever, if not the greatest American political philosopher. Now, in terms of lasting importance, I think that there are others who are not quite as good, but have had a longer lasting importance. But Calhoun definitely was unique in the types of ideas he was advancing while he was in the Senate, and out of the Senate too. But when you have these individuals, and I think this leadership is very important. The greatest leader in American history is a Southerner, George Washington. You could say one of the greatest leaders in American history was Robert E. Lee, without question. Even if you want, now I know we're not pro-Lincoln here, but if you want to say that we're looking for leadership, and so many Americans admire Lincoln as a leader, well, he was born in Kentucky. So whether we want to claim him or not, and we've had a piece on that before about how this was actually written after the war, how the South would not have lost the war if not for the South, because of how many Southerners were involved in the U.S. government still, leading the Army, and of course Lincoln himself was born a Southerner. So when you look at the importance of leadership, I think this is culturally something that the South has that maybe other places of the United States don't have as much of. It's that instinctive drive to connect to people and to be able to lead them in a direction. This is, if you look at 2016 election, that is one thing that you see a drastic difference between Trump and Clinton in terms of leadership style. Trump has an aura around him. He has what they call gravitas. He's a guy that you think this guy can lead. Whether he can or not, that's an interesting question. But he has led several companies. Clinton doesn't have any of that. Now, Trump is a New Yorker, but over time, it's really interesting, the connection between New York and the South. There was quite a lot of it there, even into the 1860s and after. New Yorkers and Southerners got along quite well at times, in fact. So it's that leadership quality that we're looking for, and all three of these individuals possess. So if we start with Charles Carroll of Carrollton, you might be wondering to yourself, who is Charles Carroll of Carrollton? Well, he was the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence, and we talked about Charles Carroll in this podcast before. I believe we talked about Carroll in the podcast. I know that St. Patrick's Day, I'm almost certain we did. We ran a piece on Charles Carroll. So here we have him again. It was his birthday on Monday, September 19th is his birthday. And so we ran a piece by Brad Berzer. Dr. Berzer is a faculty member at Hillsdale College. And he wrote a great biography of Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Now, I also wrote I wrote a short biography of Carroll in my Politically Incorrect Guide to the Founding Fathers. But if you want a longer, more definitive biography, then I think Dr. Berzer's biography is very good. He doesn't really bring out this idea that Carroll was a Southerner, but I think everyone recognized him as that during this time period. Of course, he had perhaps the largest estate in the state of Maryland, Doregan Manor, and he built a Catholic chapel on his property, and they still hold Mass there to this day, from what I understand. You can still go to Mass at Carroll's property. But what he talks about is this conservative strain of American political thought. Carroll was an individual who had been reared by a very prominent family, and he believed in that. He believed in American liberty, but he was an individual who liked what we would call maybe an aristocratic lifestyle. And he lived that way. Carroll also understood, though, as he said in several treatises, that the most important thing we could do is limit the power of the sovereign. He said, proper liberty, as Berzer says, proper liberty comes best from the limited power of the sovereign. And so Berzer continues, only a vigilant, wise, and virtuous people can maintain a free society. This is a quote from Carroll. Quote, not a single instance can be selected from our history of a law favorable to liberty obtained from government, but by the unanimous, steady, and spirited conduct of the people. So that makes him sound like a Democrat. Now, he wasn't. He believed in limited democracy. But he also believed in limiting the power of the center. And so that's very important. I mean, this is one thing that the South carried forward longer than anywhere else, limiting the power of the center. And as you get into these debates that lead into the early Federal Republic between Jefferson and Hamilton, it wasn't just Jefferson and Hamilton. It was in so many ways Southerners, people, many of them from Virginia, who were having problems with the expansion of federal power in the first Congress. People often ask me, where did things go wrong? And I say, the first Congress. This is where everything went off the rails from the very beginning, because the Constitution that was put into effect was not the Constitution that was ratified by the people of the states in 1787 and 1788. And so Carroll was very careful about where power should be lodged. This is why he advocated for the Senate. And of course, the Senate would represent the states. Carroll was a man of Maryland before he was a man of the United States, and I think that does make a difference. For example, Alexander Hamilton was a nationalist because he didn't have a state. John Marshall, even though he's from Virginia, wasn't really a Virginian. He was a nationalist because he repudiated his allegiance to his state. So I think that's very important to note that Carroll considered Maryland, his manor, Doregan Manor, his first priority, not the capital in New York, Philadelphia, or Washington, D.C., and he in fact spent more time in Maryland working on Maryland independence and the Maryland Constitution than he did in anything else. That's not brought up in this piece, but that was Carroll. So Carroll also concludes, the Great Charter, the several confirmations of it, the Petition of Right, the Bill of Rights, were all the happy effects of force and necessity. And of course, he's looking at those as being organic from the bottom up. The sovereign didn't provide that. The people checked the central authority, whatever people we're talking about. Of course, when you're talking about the Magna Carta, which he says to begin with, this is the barons. These are people like Carroll who would have put pressure on the government to reform. So Carroll was a really important guy, a man who was a leader, a man who believed in real English liberty, even though he is an Irish Catholic. In one point, he couldn't even vote in Maryland, yet he's pushing for the rights of Englishmen. I mean, that's really interesting. Here's a guy that believes in the rights of Englishmen, even if he can't vote, because they were that important. And I think this is something that we often don't think about. Our traditions come from England in many ways. I mean, we talk about Western civilization, we admire the Greeks and the Romans, but the English model of government is unique. And the United States would be nothing without it. And so I do agree with the Anglophiles that were more sympathetic to the English system than anything else, even though it had its own problems. But English civil liberties are worth hanging on to. It's essential to our current, even in our current government, to talk about these things and make people believe that we are nothing without them. It's very easy to slip into tyranny if you don't have people dedicated to those English civil liberties. All right, so on Tuesday we ran actually, I'm going to skip over Tuesday. I'm going to talk about the three individuals, and then I'll go back to the last two pieces. One's very short, and the other one is kind of within this vein, but a little different. So on Wednesday we ran a piece on James Jackson of Georgia. It was his birthday, September 21st. And James Jackson of Georgia is not well known. We've run a piece about James Jackson before. And James Jackson is one of the more important of the unknown founding fathers. Jackson, in fact, spent a lot of time in that first Congress attacking the Hamiltonian system. He's an unknown, but yet this guy was perceptive over and over again about the evils of Hamiltonianism. And then, of course, James Jackson famously led a fight against the Yazoo land claims in Georgia. And what happened there is that a bunch of northern speculators bribed the Georgia legislature to give them cut-rate deals on Western land, which later became, essentially the states of Alabama and Mississippi. But what they were looking to do there was make a huge profit. And when another Georgia legislature, in which had James Jackson then elected as governor, repealed these charters, these contracts, this issue made it to the Supreme Court. And, of course, this later led to a serious issue, the Yazoo issue. I think that this is often overlooked, how important it was for the state to be able to solve bad law itself. Of course, the federal government steps in to protect the land speculators to the harm of the people of Georgia. So Jackson was an ardent Georgian, first and foremost. He was a great patriot during the American War for Independence. He was such a force in Southern politics. We should pay more attention to James Jackson because this is true leadership. It's statesmanship again. It wasn't just sectionalism. Jackson was concerned about too much federal power because of what that could do to good, effective government. And he saw Hamilton for what he was, a liar. He saw Hamilton as a schemer, an ambitious schemer who needed to be stopped. Because the ultimate effect of Hamilton's policies, of course, is what we have today, and that is the complete loss of any sort of real federalism, which the states don't have any power. At least that's what people think. The Constitution hasn't been changed in that regard, but no one thinks about state power anymore, and Jackson was concerned that was going to happen. So James Jackson, this piece was written in 1806 by a man named Thomas U.P. Charlton, who was a citizen of Savannah, Georgia. He was a judge and an important guy in Savannah, but he knew Jackson well. And he talks about how principled Jackson was. And I think that's again important. Principles over party, principles over power. And so many Southerners exemplified that. They stayed true to their principles, even if it meant being against the wind. And we can admire them for that. So Jackson is one of those individuals. Then, of course, we have John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun really needs no introduction in this particular regard. But Dr. Wilson's position on Calhoun is very much unknown. It's Calhoun, the anti-imperialist. Calhoun, the guy who opposed the Mexican War. I remember when I was an undergraduate, the first paper I ever had to write for a major history course, it was they called it Pro Seminar of History. We had to write a major research paper. And I chose a topic on the Mexican War. And I was writing about James K. Polk. And it was a seminar, so it was my first introduction. I was only a sophomore in college. It was an introduction to a seminar environment where you wrote a paper and then you had to present it and then defend it. And I remember one of the students in there saying, the war with Mexico was just about the slave power. And I remember the professor who taught the course, and I was just 19 years old at the time, and didn't really understand how to debate this position. But the professor, who was a New Yorker, a Greek New Yorker, progressive, but he looked at this other guy and he said, well, then explain why John C. Calhoun opposed the war. And the student really couldn't do it. It was actually unfair. But this is something that people don't understand or don't realize. But John C. Calhoun, the man who was considered the spokesman for the quote-unquote slave power, opposed the war with Mexico because he thought it was lodging too much power in the executive branch. He was concerned about the precedents that would be established here. And Calhoun was not for a wide-ranging American empire, particularly not in acquiring all of Mexico, which there was a substantial faction in the Democratic Party at the time who was in favor of annexing all of Mexico. And so Calhoun was very much in this growing anti-imperialist American movement, which later took hold of the United States in the late 19th century, and you had Southerners who were opposed to the war with Spain. You had Southerners who were against World War I. And so it's interesting how this anti-imperialism comes out of the South in many ways. There were Southerners, of course, who were interested in empire and acquiring more territory. There's no doubt about it. So there were also Northerners who favored this too. But the real anti-imperialist tradition starts in many ways with Calhoun. And so this is something we don't often realize. Calhoun was more than just this very simplistic caricature of a Southerner. He's the defender of slavery, as Samuel Flagg Bemis called him, with his hair, and he's dying of tuberculosis, and he looks like a skeleton, and you got that image of Calhoun. Calhoun was so much more than that. He was deeper than that. That's just one part. And, of course, we put on the website two articles that Clyde Wilson had written about, that slavery is a positive good, what Calhoun said and what he didn't say. So if you look up Calhoun on our website, just go to the search box and type in John C. Calhoun, you'll find a number of articles about Calhoun, mostly written by Dr. Wilson. Of course, you wouldn't want them written by anybody else that's affiliated with the Institute. He spent almost his entire career editing the Calhoun papers. So I think that what we need to understand is that the Southern tradition is deeper and more complex than what most people think. And that's the South we need to talk about. Statesmanship, complexity, these issues, these things that America has been given because of the South. Without the South and the Southern tradition, some of these things don't exist. That's the South we need to champion. What is it today that America can learn from the South? I've made the statement on this podcast several times, the South is America. So was it today that Americans, modern Americans in the 21st century, can learn about the South? Again, I've said before, Richard Weaver said it best. Look, we may not want to live in the 19th century, but the 19th century South can show us different ways how to live. There are things in the Southern tradition that can bring us forward, that we can use as examples and say this would be better than what we have now. Not everything in tradition is going to be carried forward that way, but we can look at statesmanship, we can look at foreign policy, we can talk about economics, we can talk about political philosophy. These are things that Southerners can give us, these statesmen in the South can give us some examples on what to do with our current problems. We wouldn't have all of these quote-unquote problems if we had a much more federative system, because they would have been handled in the states. And actually that's where the piece that ran on Tuesday fits into this. It's by a man named Harriet Kimball, and Mr. Kimball, we've talked about him before on the podcast. Mr. Kimball has a farm in New York. It's a self-sustaining farm. And so he talks about in this particular piece reestablishing a family economy. And so when you talk about reestablishing society, how we can reinvigorate society, well, it has to start small. It has to start with the family first, and then you work your way up. You're never going to solve any of the political problems in America at the federal level. It's not going to happen. You could vote in, 100 John C. Calhouns, and the monster is too big to be tamed. So you have to tame it from the bottom up. And how do you do that? Well, you work on your own independence. And Mr. Kimball talks about that. Get out of debt. Start looking at, returning to a family economy. He says, we live in an industrial economy. Some say we're a service economy. But the problem is, the family-based model has been destroyed. So he says, in a properly functioning family economy, every member of the family, father, mother, children, grandparents, and any extended family living under the same roof, plays a role in making the family as self-sufficient as possible. Everyone is needed. So the idea is self-sufficient. But he also says you need to be able to make some money. I mean, you can't just, it's very hard just to go out and just be onto your own. And I think that's something that Southerners realized more than anything else. You still had to have community. Community was important. And so you couldn't just be an island on yourself. You had to have community. You have to make some money. You have to be able to provide some things that modern society demands. And so he's saying, look, get back to the family economy. Get back to being self-reliant, self-sufficient. If you have independence, it's much easier to make political noise because you're not concerned about your check coming from anywhere else. That is important. Too many people are tied into the system. We can talk about it all day long, whether this thing is good or that thing is good, but if we're all tied into the system, if we're all on the hind tit, as was talked about, and I'll take my stand, that we're in trouble. If we're all eating at the trough. So you have to have some independence. And the best way to do that is to start producing independence in your own life and working on that little by little. Get out of debt first and foremost. This is where, people like Dave Ramsey, who has got his famous show on how to get out of debt. I mean, it's so important. And it's hard. It's very hard in modern society to not be in any debt. Most people are. But if you could try to get out of debt, it would help you become independent and then make better political choices because you don't owe anybody anything. And you have something to defend then. And you have something to preserve. And so being independent, thinking family first, then your city, then your state, then the general government, this would change the entire direction of American politics. And that is one thing the Southern tradition is important for, because Southerners talked about that more than anyone else, longer than anyone else. Home comes first. Now, Mr. Kimball says, the primary objective of the family economy was not to make a lot of money, it was to sustain a way of life. Indeed, most farming was subsistence farming, which means the family produced just about everything they needed, bartered for what they did not have, and did not require a lot of money. He says that kind of life is hard for us to imagine these days. We figure subsistence farmers must have been poor, miserable beings, barely surviving. But these were people who knew how to make the land produce, and for the most part they operated thriving farms and homesteads. Most agrarians, he says, clearly see the blending of family life and work into a more self-sufficient family economy is the ideal. He says, I am one of those people. But the reality of the situation is, unless you are born into an already established family business or you are independently wealthy, a true and complete family economy is not easily accomplished in this modern world. He says, for new agrarians of the 21st century to reestablish family economies, we need to, first, get out of bondage to debt. A key part of doing this is to simplify our needs and wants. We must tame our tendency towards materialism and consumerism. Then we must endeavor to supply as many of our family's needs as possible. And finally, we must also create family businesses that generate enough actual money to pay the most necessary of living costs in our very expensive industrial economy. He says, all this is an enormous challenge. Actually, that's what I like about this piece. He's not a utopian. He says this is all hard, and it's hard to do. And it's not something you can do overnight, but if you begin slowly and you start making plans, you can have it. And he's eventually done it. So he gives you some, there's going to be another part to this. This is just part one. And on that theme, the last piece, which is just a couple hundred words written by yours truly for Friday, it's entitled Washington's Rye. What most people don't realize about plantations is that they were self-sufficient entities, and they produced a lot of different things. And one thing Washington produced at Mount Vernon was whiskey. And you can still get your hands on some of this whiskey. The Mount Vernon Society, the people that run it, Friends of Mount Vernon, they have rebuilt his distillery. And you can go there and you can buy yourself a jug of Washington's Rye. It's interesting because it's not aged. It still is clear. They have apple brandy and other things, but you got to buy it in person. But I think this is an important thing to recognize about self-sufficiency. The idea of the South, of the plantation, of the farm, was always to be self-sufficient. To even produce things that could be sold on the open market. Washington sold all his whiskey to Alexandria, and he made a lot of money doing it. But the idea was to always be self-sufficient. Nathaniel Macon in North Carolina only checked his mail one time a month. He checked his mail once a month. Now, how many people could get away with that? He had his own chapel. This is what Carroll had, his own chapel on his property. Most planters had that. So there was self-sufficiency there. It was its own type of community. And that's the part that's lost in our descriptions of the South and the Southern tradition. Community, self-sufficiency, producing what you need. Family comes first. Statesmanship. These are things that the South has bequeathed to our generation. If you're younger, if you're middle-aged, or if you're older, you're still here, alive and kicking, listening to this podcast. Those are the things, if you're an older person, tell your grandkids and your kids about. If you're middle-aged, tell your kids. If you're young, start living it. You actually have, as a young person, if you're hearing this podcast, you're in your 20s, you could plan your whole life for this and change the world by changing yourself. Because if you change yourself and you start living this way now, and there's a lot of young people who are, you become independent now, no one will own you. You can change the direction of America, and that would be the Southern model. We don't think about that, but it is. Remember, the South is America. Change yourself now. Do not get into debt. Become as independent as you can. Learn from the statesmen of the antebellum and even postbellum South about leadership. Lead by example. Lead good, ethical, moral lives. And you will be the elite. Learn as much as you can. Read as much as you can. That is one thing about people like Calhoun and Carroll. They were well read. Learn and read as much as you can. Because you can affect the future of not just the South, but also America. And I think that would be the most lasting contribution if you could look back and see what you accomplished. That would be great. Until next time, good day.